According to the brothers Grimm, there was once a shepherd boy who so loved excitement that he was forever turning in false wolf alarms for the fun of seeing the villagers come running to the pasture, armed with clubs and guns to deal with a wolf. As time went on, and no wolf was ever there when the villagers arrived, fewer and fewer of them answered his calls for help. And finally, when the wolf actually came, no one at all paid any attention to him, and the wolf ate him up. If the Grimms were collecting folk tales today, they might find a story that goes like this. Once there was a shepherd boy who was so afraid of having enemies that he refused to believe that wolves existed at all. When the wolf made off with one of his flock, he always managed to think of some likely-sounding story with which to convince himself and the villagers that no wolf had been involved. The wolf grew strong and commenced to raise a family, and the shepherd boy got better and better at inventing stories to account for the diminution of his flock, so that pretty soon no one believed in wolves any longer, and the wolf and his cubs could walk through the village streets without fear of being recognized. If the story were carried to its logical conclusion, the ending would be far worse than that of the original tale. For if the wolves were smart enough to realize that the shepherd boy was the best friend they had, they could pull down all the sheep and indeed all the villagers as hunger decreed. All they would have to do would be to save the shepherd boy until last, for he would always find a way of convincing the survivors that there were no wolves. Indeed, I suspect that he would be telling himself the same thing even while the wolves were dragging him off to their lair. There are wolves aplenty in the world today, and our government and our press and our halls of learning are literally full of shepherd boys who cannot allow themselves, or anyone else if they can possibly help it, to believe in wolves. Unlike the shepherd boy in the story, they are willing to admit that Soviet Russia once was somewhat carnivorous. But, they insist, she has filed down her fangs and become a vegetarian. She might unthinkingly get a little rough at times, but she means well and would never hurt a soul. 12 years ago, that particular wolf pulled down the equivalent of one of the villagers. Russia invaded Hungary and brutally crushed its people and has been gnawing their bones ever since. The free world stood in horrified paralysis and watched unbelieving, and no one lifted a finger to help. Since then, Russia has been involved in many coups and attempted coups among the developing nations. American troops have been killed by Soviet guns and bombs everywhere they have fought in the last 20 years. And once Russia went so far as to indicate quite clearly that the United States was on her list. Russian missiles aimed at the industrial and population centers of the United States were installed in Cuba. But our shepherd boys keep telling us how friendly are Moscow's intentions, how good-hearted are the people of Russia, how much the Soviet government has mellowed over the years.